Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Siona, this is Little Black Cat Gaming, and in this video I'm going to talk about my process for painting the Lonely Tree from the body horror board game Kingdom Death Monster. In the game, this model represents a tree that can either be beneficial or detrimental. It consumes its victims and drinks their blood, and then produces lovely, fleshy little fruits. This entire paint job took approximately 8 hours to complete, including the little fruits. My husband had originally started to paint this model, but was unsure how to proceed, which is why it already has a base coat. It's been sitting in the cabinet now for months, just waiting for someone to finish it. I decided to do something a bit different from his vision of ghostly white and blood red and went with a more zombie flesh undead theme. I found this great piece of art by Tolek Gajdomovich on his Pinterest and I thought it was a great reference. I've put a link to his Pinterest in the video description so you can check out his art. The first thing to do is base coat this little sprout. I started with a base coat of Vallejo Heavy Grey, which is more of a green-brown than grey, so it's perfect as an undercoat for zombie flesh. I used a large, cheap synthetic brush for most of this model. Usually I use a Kolinsky sable brush, but most of the painting in this model is dry brushing, and nothing ruins a brush faster than dry brushing, so I decided to spare my pricey brushes this fate. The next step is to add some deep shadows into the crevices. The fastest and easiest way to achieve this is with a wash. Here I'm using Army Painter's Strong Tone and applying it generously all over the grey base coat, ensuring it gets into all the little nooks and crannies. It's okay if this tints the base coat darker because I will reinforce the highlights in a future step. Ensure your base coat is fully dry before you add your wash. I use a hairdryer to speed up the process. Once the wash is completely dry, I start dry brushing in some contrast and highlights. I'm using a combination of Vallejo Dead Flesh and Scale Colour Iroko, both mixed and unmixed, to give some interest to the highlights. Dead Flesh is the lighter tone, so I mainly concentrated on the upper surfaces, which would receive light from above, and where the lanterns would shine for future object source lighting. If you've ever made a study of human skin, you will know that it's not just pink or brown or white, but contains a large and subtle range of tones from blue, green, yellow, and red. Dead flesh is no different. To achieve this subtle life, I've added glazes of colour using Citadel shades, starting with Druky Eye Violet. Then adding some Drakenhof Nightshade and Seraphim Sepia. And finally, a botanical touch with Celia Greenshade. It is a tree after all. Once all of the underlying colour variation is done, I can bring back some of my highlights using Vallejo's Dead Flesh, concentrating on the upper surfaces and areas of lantern light. I'm still using the same brush and applying a light dry brush in a couple of layers to build up the desired colour. Now onto the fun stuff, object source lighting. I'm still developing my skills in painting OSL, but there are a couple of rules I try to keep in mind when I do it. First, decide where exactly the light would realistically fall and try to keep it within those areas. And second, the cast light is never as bright as or brighter than the light source. With that in mind, I am applying some Vallejo Filthy Brown, which is a dark yellow, to where I think the lantern light would fall. This is really just a guide to help me visualize the cast light. Because the lanterns are casting firelight, the colour range in the object source lighting will be warm, starting from dark orange or even red, the further away the light source is, up to bright yellow where the light source is the closest. Here I start with a dry brush of scale colour Aldebaran Red. The next step in the OSL is to add that warm orange fire. Both Vallejo's Orange Fire and Hot Orange are great for firelight, and I use both interchangeably. I am trying to make the Orange Fire highlight smaller than the previous red coat. No firelight would be complete without the bright yellow hotspots closest to the source of the light. Here I'm using Vallejo Sun Yellow and dry brushing only where the lanterns shine the hottest. I also add a little Vallejo Dead White to really push those hotspots. I was originally going to keep the full red of these leaves, but I changed my mind, as you will see later in the video. Here I am using some Vallejo Gory Red and just tidying up any spots that were missed in the original paintwork, and any bits that I accidentally painted over with my base coat. I'm washing the leaves here with Citadel Null oil to darken the recesses. At this stage, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the leaves other than keep the red, so I am dry brushing on some highlights with Vallejo's Blood Red. It still wasn't red enough, so I'm bringing back that saturation with a glaze of Vallejo red ink. At this point, I decided that in order for the cast light to appear brighter, the areas of shadow needed to be darker, so I grabbed my Agrex Earthshade and glazed it into the areas I wanted darker shadows. I used the same type of paint for my glaze as my initial wash. The difference is when I'm washing, I want the paint to collect in the crevices and lines and not sit on the high spots, whereas a glaze is used to gradually change the hue, saturation or luminosity of a surface. In this case, I used the dark brown to make the shadows darker and encouraged the paint to sit on the higher surfaces. Now it's time to paint the lanterns. This tree has a lot of them, and in fact lanterns are an integral part of the World of Kingdom Death Monster, so I try to paint them as if they are lit wherever I can. Painting lanterns at this scale is fairly easy. I start with a base coat of Vallejo Hot Orange all over each lantern pane. The next step is to stipple in some Vallejo Sol Yellow to start to create the illusion that they are lit. This yellow only goes onto the center area of each pane and blends into the orange on either end. I'm using an old dry brush to do this step as I like how the splayed bristles produce texture. The yellow area should be slightly smaller than the orange panes, and you should be able to see some orange around each yellow spot. The final step on the lanterns for now is the white hotspot in the center of each pane. This represents the flame, the hottest part of the light, and should be the brightest part of the scene. You should be able to see some of your yellow around each white hotspot. I decided to go with true metallics for this project. The reasons being I'm still learning how to do non-metallic metal, and there really isn't enough metal in this model to justify a non-metallic. I think true metallic looks great, and it works really well in this situation, especially once the special effects paints are used. For my version of true metallic, I start with a very dark metallic paint in the same hue as where I want to end up. If it's a grey metal, I start with Vallejo's black metal, and if it's a yellow metal, I start with Vallejo's tinny tin. taking a bit more care with painting the lantern structure, as I don't want metal paint on my nice shiny panels. I'll often use an edge highlighting technique for these sorts of applications, painting the raised edges of the model with the side of my brush for more control. Now onto the various bits of leather hanging from this little tree. I find Scale 75's black leather to be an excellent base for this, combined with the other leather colours from the Scale colour range. I am just base coating the leather in this step, and will add variation, highlights and object source lighting in later steps. Here I'm adding a little Scale Colour Mars Orange and Vallejo Hot Orange to the leathers to brighten them where they would receive light from the lanterns. I also take this moment to reinforce the highlights on the tree to better match the lanterns now that they are painted. The next step in highlighting the leather is to paint a little Scale Colour brown leather on the upper surfaces of the leather parts, where they would receive light from the environment. You can go a little rough with this step since leather is not always a uniform colour and has quite a lot of texture and colour variation, especially if it's been hanging in a tree exposed to the elements. I have no idea why there would be cowbells hanging in this tree. I can't decide if they are bells or bottles, but I painted them as bells. I'm sure there is some reason for it in the world lore, but we haven't played the Lonely Tree expansion yet, so for now they are just there. I am base coating with Vallejo Tinny Tin as I mentioned earlier, starting with the darkest metal before highlighting up. As is only logical for a carnivorous tree, there are several skulls hanging here and there in its branches. These are all base coated with Vallejo Dead Flesh to give them that aged patina. Following the base coat, the skulls are washed with a generous coating of Athonian camo shade. Normally I would use a brown wash for skulls, but I wanted these ones to look like they have moss or algae growing on them, so green was more suitable. I want the wash to glaze the raised areas, as well as collect into the deep crevices. Once my wash is dry, I add a little highlighting to the skulls using Bone White from Vallejo. This is added where the light would land from above, as well as where the lanterns would shine. I try not to go too heavy with my highlights here, as I don't want the skulls to stand out too brightly, or they won't fit in with the rest of the scene. Here I am back to my Vallejo Hot Orange, adding warmth from the lanterns onto the skulls to ground them into their surroundings. Often I will take stock of where a painting is at and revisit areas if I feel there needs to be more contrast, or more shadow, or more saturation. For me, painting is more by feel than formula, and I have no problems completely changing something if I don't think it's working. I felt that the leather was looking a little dull at this point, so I decided to give it a wash with Agrex Earthshade to deepen the shadows and bring the leathers out from the tree branches a little, and to give the texture a warmer, richer appearance. Then I give the metal chains, shields, and other bits and pieces a wash with Citadel's Nuln oil to provide a deep area of contrast between the chain, leather, and branches before I move on to highlighting the metals. little scale colour Mars Orange mixed with brown leather to really push the highlights on these leather straps. Painting this mix only where the light would be shining from above and from the lanterns. Leather is a fairly shiny material, so don't be afraid to go fairly tight with your specular highlights. I felt that the leather still wasn't quite right, so I added a quick glaze of Citadel's Fugan Orange to make it warmer. My copy of Kingdom Death Monster has the stone faces painted black and dry brushed to look like actual stone, so I went with the same theme here. First, using carbon black from Jo Sonja, which is an artist quality medium body acrylic and lovely to use because of its heavy pigmentation, large tube and extremely matte finish. I apply this all over the base, ensuring I have complete coverage and trying not to paint over too many of those buttress roots. For the first layer of highlighting, I'm applying a heavy dry brush of carbon black with a little white added to make a very dark grey. I want this all over the stone faces except in the very deepest areas. To build the highlights, I simply add a little more white and make each subsequent layer of dry brushing lighter until I am highlighting the very tips of the features on the stone faces with a very light grey. This model has some pretty hard to reach spots around the roots, so I use a wash of Nuln oil to pool into those areas and ensure they are completely in shadow. This wash also emphasises features on the stone face that may have been lost in the highlighting steps, and helps provide some contrast between the tree and the base. I don't want this to tint the stone faces, so I am using a piece of paper towel to blot off any wash that is on the raised parts of the base. Here I've gone back to my Vallejo Dead Flesh to highlight any roots that were obscured during the base painting. This is just a quick step, reinforcing what was already there. usually quite enjoy the step of highlighting metals. It's satisfying to see that gleam come out. I'm using Vallejo's Glorious Gold and Chrome for the two metals in this scene, with a light, small dry brush, trying not to get it onto the surrounding areas. I really like Citadel's technical paints, and I use them whenever I get the opportunity. Because I went with a copper type metal for the bells, I'm using Nilac oxide to give them the kind of oxidation you would see on copper when it's left out in the elements. I think this effect looks really great. Typist corrosion is really good for adding a rusty, dirty, old feeling to metals, so I've used it here on my chains, shields and weapons. I let both settle into the cracks, and then I wipe off some of the excess from the raised surfaces, as corrosion typically forms more where metal touches other things, not necessarily on the outer surfaces. I give the bells a final wash of Seraphim Sepia to give them a warm glow. Once I am done with the corrosion, I bring back the highlights of the metal chains and other bits with a light brush of Vallejo Chrome. Now that the entire tree is almost finished, I can see what I want to do with the leaves. I decided to paint the undersides of the leaf clumps with heavy green and leave the tips red. I have a houseplant whose leaves start out red and gradually turn green as they age, and I wanted to try and achieve something similar here, with new growth at the tops and older foliage at the base. With the heavy green base done, I do a quick dry brush of the leaves with Vallejo Lime Green to provide some contrast. I take this dry brush layer outside of the green base coat and up onto the red leaves above to give the impression of the leaves transitioning from green to red. I want the new growth on the leaves to really pop, so I am dry brushing the very tips with bright Mars Orange before the next step, which is blood effects. Of course a carnivorous tree bleeds. I'm using another Citadel technical paint here, Blood for the Blood God, which gives a very nice shiny fresh blood effect. I'm adding the blood in a random pattern throughout the joins in the leaf bundles. Yet another Citadel technical paint, one I like a lot even if it does make me feel a bit off. Nurgle's Rot, which makes for a sickly oozing pus effect for among the roots and branches of our rotting undead tree. I'm applying this into the crevices and pooling amongst the roots and stone faces. All around the base and growing up the trunk of this tree are these little vines. I give each of them a coat of Vallejo lime green to make them stand out a little from the trunk and indicate that there is still some life here amongst the rot. Object source lighting never seems to be done. I will often revisit effects like this while painting the rest of the model, as every edition can change the way the OSL appears. I felt it needed to be warmer in contrast with the cool browns and greens of the tree itself, so I'm just reinforcing that with some Citadel Cassandora yellow. This step needs little explanation really. I just glued on the bare plastic game base and now that needs to be primed in order for the final paint layer to stick. I use a few different primers, but one of my favourite for both brush and airbrush is Vallejo Primer in black. You don't need full solid coverage, just enough for the paint to adhere to. A quick wash of Athonian Camo shade was added to the green undersides of the leaves to give them deeper shadows in the recessed areas. I thought it might be cool if the leaves were bleeding blood instead of sap and dripping onto the branches and base below. More blood for the blood god. This paint has a nice viscosity which lets me build it up like it is actually dripping. I also pull it onto the base below where it runs off the branches. The tree is done and I have set it aside to allow the paint to cure before its final coat of matte varnish. Now I can move on to these sweet little flesh monster fruit babies. I'm painting all 6 of these at once, so I'm sorry if this is a tad repetitive. I do the same process with each one, making minor variations between them for interest. I did think about painting them as actual flesh, but where there is concept art, I like to stay close to that. So these are a melange of brown, red, purple, yellow and green. I'm painting these quickly, using glazes and washes to build up colour variation. Each one starts with a base coat of Vallejo charred brown. next layer is a dry brush of Mars orange and hot orange mixed about 50-50 to get a good light contrast from the base coat. It is dry brushed all over the surface. Because these fruits can be hung in the tree or given to survivors during the game, there is no set light source for them, so I'm trying to give them a nice omnidirectional light source. Concept art has these guys with a sort of mottled red, yellow and orange skin, so I'm glazing them with these colours in different places to achieve that effect. I'm using both Citadel washes and Vallejo inks, as well as a bit of Mars orange and Sol yellow for this step. add that kind of sickly life into the recesses, each one gets a wash all over with Druki Violet. With Vallejo's lime green, I pick out each of the little bumps and spots on the skins. And follow that with a wash of Athonian Camo Shade to make them stand out from the surface. And finally, with a small brush, I touch the tips of each of the little spikes and teeth with a spot of bone white. If you liked this video, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. I hope to be bringing video content to my channel more often now that I finally have a permanent recording set up. I have used music by Conrad in this video with permission. You can find a link to his website in the description box. Enjoy the photos of the finished lonely tree.